Hi, and welcome to another episode of Method Ministries. And today we are joined by Dr. Ryan Mullins, and he's here to tell us all about Molinism. Now, I'm not a Molinist, but if you're like me, I love hearing about other viewpoints, even if I don't believe it. Like, it always gets me thinking biblically, and I'm trying to test the scriptures and to challenge them myself. So at the end of the day, even if I'm not holding this position, the goal is to come out more knowledgeable in the scriptures and to think through these things again biblically. So, I'm super excited to have Ryan Mullins here and tell us all about Molinism. So, thank you, Ryan, for being here. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I found you I believe like last year. I want to say, well, definitely last year because it's only February. But I found you last year, and you were talking about God and time, which I love that subject too. Maybe this conversation will kind of lead in that direction. But you got me thinking. I can tell like you're a very intelligent man, and you're very very interesting in like how you challenge us, and again just to get us thinking about these things biblically. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Good. I try to get people thinking, but
Yeah, you
it
definitely
doesn't always
do.
work out that way.
You're in the States again too.
Yeah, so I'm finally back in the U.S. after being in the UK for on and off for about 10 years, and then in Finland for 2 years. So,
Wow.
so I've been living all over the place for a very long time.
Wow, and is that because of doctoral work, or like you're working on a book, if my memory serves it correct?
It's a bit of both. So I moved to Scotland originally for my PhD, and
Nice.
then I was in England for a year doing a teaching fellowship at the University of Cambridge.
Hmm.
And then I went back to Scotland for several years to do a research position at St Andrews, and then at Edinburgh, and then at some point, then I got a research fellowship at the Collegium for Advanced Studies in Finland, and so that's when I ended up there. So it's been for like
Wow.
school and then for work and everything. So it's taken me everywhere.
Yeah, I bet a lot of exciting stories. I mean, I bet I heard Scotland. I bet that was beautiful.
It's parts of Scotland are really beautiful, but it's also really gray. But it's not as cold as parts of the U.S. this time of year. So it's got its pros and cons.
Oh, really? So we're actually colder than them, huh?
Oh yeah, it very rarely gets below freezing in the part of
Wow.
Scotland I was living in, and very rarely saw snow. So I got really used to mild winters, and then now moving back here to the States,
Nice.
and
Well,
this Christmas it was like -20, and I was like, I just left Finland. I didn't want to come back to like -20,
well, hopefully you got some like Scottish like wool sweaters or something like
I
that.
do, I do. I've got plenty of those.
That's awesome. Ship me one if you can.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, yeah, again, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited for this conversation. But just so our audience can know, I want you to go ahead and introduce yourself, who
Mhm.
you are, and what you do, and anything else you want to say.
Yeah, so I'm a philosophical theologian. I primarily work on different theories of the nature of God. I also do a lot of work in philosophy of time and philosophy of emotions, and then lots of different Christian doctrines. So I've written a couple different books, actually like three
Hmm.
now, and I've just completed four, and I'll talk about another one in a little bit. And then I've also written over 50 essays on lots of different topics within philosophy and theology. I teach
Wow.
for two different master's programs.
Hmm.
So if people want to study with me, they've got options. So I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Lucerne, which is in Switzerland.
Oh,
And so
wow.
this is like a hybrid master's program. So it's partly online. And then there's some really good opportunities in person to do a summer school in either Italy or in Switzerland. It's supposedly going to alternate between the two.
Wow.
And this is a program for people who are looking to get a good foundation in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy.
Wow.
And then I'm also teaching intensive master's courses for Palm Beach Atlantic University for their master's in philosophy of religion, and that's primarily just in person. So if people want to study with me in the U.S. or in Europe or wherever, yeah, you've got some options.
And even online, you mentioned too, I think.
hmm Yeah,
Gotcha.
so the Switzerland program is primarily online, except for the summer school, which is in person.
Okay. Okay. And just to talk about your next book, because this goes into our topic. So, what is your current book that you're working on?
Yeah, so I finished the first draft actually this morning
Hmm.
for this book. It's called A Little Book About a Big God. And so what I'm trying to do is write a book that's about like 100 pages or so,
Okay.
and it'll only be $20, so it won't be like these insane like textbook prices,
Yeah.
and just give a concise statement of what I think about God, the nature of God, and then look at some neglected questions that relate to God's perfect rationality. So questions like why would God create anything at all? Why would God create this particular universe? and then it gets into lots of different questions about theories of providence. So, and then it's got some like devotion and some sarcasm thrown in. So it's a mix of different things.
Wow. Is that 100 pages of like single space words, like really
At,
small?
at the moment, single space, but it's it's normal size font.
Yeah, like forward to it. Yeah, because I think I looked at a couple of your other books on Amazon. One of them sounded really interesting too. I believe it was on God and Time was one of
Mhm.
them.
Yeah. So I've
Nice.
got one on God and Time. I just finished writing another book, a sequel to that book. So a second book on God and Time. It's currently under review. I'm hoping it'll be published by the end of this year, but
Okay.
with these academic publishers, it takes a long time.
Wow.
So who knows?
And is this current book you're working on like does that go into Molinism, or does it like touch on those ideas that are related to it?
So one of the things I do in this little book about a big God is I look at Calvinism, Molinism, and open theism, and
Okay.
try to give some reasons for and against each view. So when you're thinking in terms of what kind of universe would God create, would He create a Calvinist universe or a Molinist universe or an open theist universe? What are the reasons for and against each of those? And that's one of the many different questions that I tackle in the little book about a big God.
Okay. And you touch on the Arminian, perspective as well?
Not as much because
Yeah.
when you look at Arminius, he affirms middle knowledge.
This
He
is
affirms
true.
this sort of Molinist view. So Arminianism, as far as I can tell, is just Molinism, like a Molinist theory of providence, and there's being really quiet about how God gets the foreknowledge, because a lot of people are really quiet about that. They don't like to answer that question.
Okay. Yeah.
So Arminianism kind of does that, and then
Mhm.
it gives a more detailed sort of account of salvation and everything, whereas Molinism itself is primarily a theory of just the providence.
Okay. And when you considered yourself a Molinist?
I lean really heavily towards Molinism. Something we'll talk
Gotcha.
about later is I've still got some worries about it. I can address some of those, and some of them I don't know how to answer.
Interesting.
But at the moment, yeah, I lean quite heavily towards Molinism.
You lean toward, okay. So yes, you're not like the William Lane Craig who's like
Right.
wears the label and proudly like that.
Yeah. I'm like, it sounds cool. It sounds really cool.
Yeah.
But I got some reservations. I've got some
But
reservations
you're
about it.
honest.
Yeah, I'm trying to be intellectually
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So you're honest. Yeah, definitely. Well, that being said, why don't you go, ahead and tell our viewers all about, what is Molinism? Because, I understand it, but there's more I could know about it. And I feel like, I don't know if you feel like this too. I kind of feel like maybe it's getting some more traction lately, especially with the William Lane Craig debates going on and everything. I feel
Mhm.
like it's getting a little more attention. So I think this would be, a good opportunity to learn about, hey, like what is, again, like what is Molinism? Like what is this about?
Yeah. So Molinism is primarily a theory of divine providence that tries to incorporate a libertarian account of human freedom and a libertarian account of divine freedom. And so it's got this unique feature called middle knowledge, or what sometimes is called God's hypothetical knowledge of what you would freely do in any possible situation you might find yourself in. So here's the big idea. So
Mm,
imagine God prior to creation. So God all alone, He hasn't created anything at all. In this pre-created state, there are supposedly different logical moments, is the way Calvinists and Molinists and others talk. I prefer to think of them as temporal moments because I avoid contradictions
mhm,
by thinking in these terms. And so here's the claim that the Calvinist and the Molinist and the open theist all agree on. So they'll say there's this first moment that we call the moment of natural knowledge. And at this moment of natural knowledge, God knows His own nature, His own essence. And that is supposed to give God knowledge of all the logical possibilities, all the things that He could possibly create. At this first moment, though, of natural knowledge, God does not know what He will do. He doesn't know if He's going to create or not create because He hasn't decided yet.
mm.
So the claim is it's completely open of what will happen. There are no facts about the future because God hasn't even decided if He's going to create. So this is what the Molinist and the Calvinist and the open theist all agree on.
Hmm.
Now the Molinist wants to go, okay, well, so God's got all this knowledge of what could take place, but that the next moment, this moment called middle knowledge, the moment of middle knowledge, God has this knowledge of this is what these creatures with libertarian freedom would do in any possible circumstance that they might be placed in. God still hasn't decided if He's going to create. He's still thinking about it. So there's still no knowledge of what will in fact happen because it's not settled what will happen in the future because God's not even decided to create. He's just looking at here's what these creatures would freely do in any possible world, any possible timeline that they would find them in. So God's supposed to use this knowledge of these all these hypothetical scenarios to kind of whittle down to go, I like that universe instead of that universe. And so then God decides, I want to create something and I want to create that universe. And at that point, God gets something called free knowledge. So this next moment is free knowledge, which is the knowledge that God has about what will take place. And that knowledge is based on what he has freely decided to do. So that's why it's called free knowledge.
Hmm.
So the three terms you need to think of are could, would, and will. So first it starts out, God knows this is what could happen. Then God considers what would happen.
Hmm.
And then God makes a decision to say, I want this particular universe. And then now God knows what will happen. Those are the big ideas. And I can define any of those terms further if you want.
Okay. And you said in the beginning, or the beginning of before God actually decided, okay, I'm
Mhm.
going to create the world. Do people acknowledge, like do theologians come to that consensus that God, almost in a sense, like had the choice to create or not create, or do some say it was like a necessity, or maybe they don't even acknowledge that God was thinking, should I create, just
Mhm.
using human language, like, should I create or should I not create? Do people and theologians acknowledge that that's what they hold or affirm? Or is
The
that kind of like,
majority, yeah, no, I understand what you're asking. So the
okay,
majority view throughout the Western world, and then surprisingly also within Eastern philosophy, like in Hinduism, is that God is free to create or not create. That's the majority view,
yeah,
and people are really explicit about this.
hmm,
Um, you get some people who will deny this. So there's people like Avicenna who will say God has to create, and you'll get some other people who do affirm something called the Dionysian principle, which is
yeah,
this idea that God's goodness is necessarily diffusive. What that means is like God's goodness just has to create more and more good stuff. So on that view, you get God has to create. He has to exist with a universe of some sort. And you see this a lot in a lot of panentheists. They typically affirm this, but they don't all do this. This is really annoying because I was writing a paper trying to figure out what panentheism is. I've written a
yeah.
few papers on this, and every time I figure out what I think it is, then somebody throws a wrench in it, and I'm like, it's just all wrong. So
Yeah, I
what
never heard
happened
that term.
recently? Yeah, panentheism. The idea is like the universe is in God, but God's more than the universe.
Oh, okay. I think I might have heard something like that
Well,
actually.
everybody says this though. I mean, this is just omnipresence. So
Okay.
figuring out what it's supposed to be this unique model of God it's more scientific than your view of God. It's more like relational than your view of God. It's better than all
Mm,
than every. I'm like, okay, well, what is it? And I can't figure out what it is. So what I thought in a more recent paper that I published is that if you're a panentheist, you're affirming that God has to create the universe or has to create a universe of some sort.
okay.
And so I was like, okay. Then I was looking at a bunch of Hindu philosophers who are everyone agrees they're panentheists. And then I was looking at their work, and they all go, actually, no, God doesn't have to create. They have this idea called lila, or like playfulness, uh, and it's supposed to try to. This idea is supposed to affirm that like God doesn't have to create; He creates just because it's fun to, or something like that. But He doesn't have to create. And I was like, well, crap. Now I don't know what your view is. So yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah. So all
Throw a
that to
wrench in
say, the
there.
majority of people in the East and the West say God does not have to create. It's
And
it's
and
it's free to create.
gotcha. Yeah, and that's what Christianity means when we say, like, the universe is contingent, like it was
Mhm.
subject to choice or chance, chance being a God, the determining factor in it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
And Molinism has that super explicitly. So does Calvinism. They have it very explicitly because, like I said, at that moment of natural knowledge, it is undetermined what's going to happen because God has not decided whether or not to create. And you see this really explicitly in Molina and and in a lot of different Calvinists as well.
So natural knowledge is what God, could do? Is that what, his,
Mhm. So
for lack of a better term, options?
yeah, exactly. It's all of the logically possible options.
Okay,
So all the possible timelines, if you want to think in that sort of term, all the possible universes God could create, all the possible creatures God could create, that's what he knows at that moment of natural knowledge. He knows his own nature, and his nature somehow generates all of the possibilities.
okay, and then free knowledge is that related to, like, the created universe of God? Like, what could happen within that universe?
So yeah, so again, so at natural knowledge, God knows what could happen. At middle knowledge, God knows what would happen hypothetically if
Okay,
in any possible situation, what you would really do with your freedom. Not just like it's logically possible you do X, Y, or Z, but like, no, that's what you would in fact do. because it's logically possible. Like you eat like a turkey sandwich right now. Like
Yeah.
that's a logical possibility.
Yeah.
But what would you actually freely do? Well, that's different. That's different. And so that's what middle knowledge is supposed to capture. And
Okay.
then the free knowledge is God's freely decided to say, I want that universe and that timeline.
Is
So
it
it's based on his free decision. And now he has foreknowledge.
mm,
And now he
and
knows what will happen.
okay. And is another way to say this, like counterfactual knowledge, like there are counterfactuals, like what could be.
hmm So counterfactuals, um, that used to be the term that when Molinism kind of went under a revival in the late 20th century, it made a big
Mm,
comeback. And the sort of philosophical tools we had in analytic philosophy to talk about these were counterfactuals, which are facts that are not really the case, but they're counter to what is actually the case. Uh, some more recent work has kind of pointed out that maybe it's not really the best way to think about it,
oh,
because
really?
because yeah, when you're thinking about God all by himself,
Hmm.
he's considering possibilities. He's not considering counterfactuals because he hasn't even created a universe at all. The whole idea of counterfactuals is like there is a way the world is, and then here's all these things that are counter to the actual story.
Wow,
And
that's
whereas
interesting.
this is like there's no story yet because he's not even decided if he's going to create. So people
Wow.
now will typically talk about hypothetical knowledge, but this is like, I mean, this is like super nerdy stuff that you're seeing some philosophers work out that hasn't made its way down to the popular level yet, which is fine because it's really the same idea. It's just getting better terms to kind of capture it.
I guess I can kind of see that difference with like the counterfactuals, like if like you said, like getting more technical. I guess that it sounds like it would be true then, like maybe use a different term to explain what they mean by that at that beginning point
Right.
or
Because the
prior to
possible,
that.
yeah, because all the possible world semantics that we typically use in philosophy, analytic philosophy at least, it's designed to do a particular kind of thing, and it doesn't seem to really capture the sort of dynamic nature of reality that I think you have to if you're talking about God and time and creation.
Hmm. And then just to as we're
Mhm.
going more into Molinism, what's the history of Molinism? Like how old is it? Where did it start? And all that like the surrounding the history of it to where it is now. What's the history?
So it primarily goes back to the 1500s. So there's this guy named Luis de Molina, where we get Molinism from, and so he's this Catholic philosopher trying to figure out exactly how does predestination, how does providence, how does all this stuff work. And so it goes back to the 1500s with this guy. Now,
Okay.
there are sometimes people try to find it earlier in church history, and I don't think you can, because a lot of the philosophical machinery that Molinism works from is developed by this Scottish philosopher named John Duns Scotus in the late 1200s.
Hmm.
So what Scotus does is he's really worried about how can God be free, and then how can creatures be free, and some problems and puzzles related to providence and free will and sin and this kind of stuff. So he develops this idea of these logical moments in the life of God, and he also thinks you could have it in the life of creatures too. And then also he tweaks this other thing called the doctrine of concurrence, which is about how God and creatures both act in the world. So Scotus makes a bunch of really interesting distinctions and does create some really cool philosophy to
Hmm.
kind of get a lot of these ideas up and running. And that stuff has a profound impact on all the subsequent thinkers. So his idea of logical moments and of concurrence and everything, it has a huge impact on Calvinists and Molinists and Arminians and all this sort of stuff afterwards. So the reason I'm hesitant to say you could find Molinism like earlier in church history is because just certain ideas just didn't exist. And the ideas that Molina uses to develop these things just didn't exist until the 1200s.
Does that mean then like Molinism? Would you say that Molinism is a reaction to something, or is it just like a development of the church progressing in theology?
I guess it could go either way, and that's fine because when you look at the history of ideas, what you see in each generation of Christians is they're trying to figure out some kind of problem,
Yeah.
and the next generation comes along and goes, it doesn't quite work, and they try to fix it. And so this is like basically just all of theology. I mean, when I read like an early church father, and they give me kind of what looks like systematic theology, and then I look at like a contemporary book, like a contemporary systematic theology, there is a huge development in
Yeah.
doctrine. I mean, there just is. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, think of like Athanasius would write like, a little essay, and you're like, here's all of Christian theology, and then now like, and then you get to Aquinas, and you're like, it just fills up a whole library, and you're like, what's going
Yeah.
on here? It's like there's a development of doctrine because problems pop up. People are trying to figure out how to address them. Some of those problems come from the culture. Some of them come from just reflection on scripture. Some of it come from people trying to address weird conflicts in their own theology, and developments come and go. I mean, that's just how it is.
And then what do you mean when you say if you can help explain logical was it logical moments versus
Mhm.
temporal moments? Like you prefer temporal, or no, sorry, you prefer temporal moments to
Yeah.
logical? Okay.
So temporal moments. So a moment of time is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So right now, there's a way things are. You and me are sitting here talking.
Yeah.
Things could be otherwise at the next moment. They could be subsequently otherwise at the next moment. And so a moment of time serves as a when something happens, and then it has built into it a way things are and the way they could be at later moments. Logical moments, they have the exact same structure as temporal moments, but the claim is they're not temporal at all.
Hmm.
Here's what's going on.
Okay.
So there's this thing called the necessity of the present. So you're sitting right now.
Yep.
That means you can't be standing right now. Like you could stand at the next moment.
So like A can be A and not, or like like a logical contradiction. A can't be A and not A.
Right. Because once you're
Gotcha.
sitting, you're sitting. I
Yeah.
mean, like, that's it. It's too late. You can't do anything else.
Yeah.
But nobody's really worried about that in terms of our freedom because, well, at the next moment, I could do something else. So, yeah. So once I'm sitting, like, yeah, I can't do anything else. Oh, well, at the next moment, I'll do something else. When you're looking at divine timelessness, though, God only exists for a single timeless moment that lacks a before and after, and that has no succession in it at all. So whatever God's doing, he's just doing. And so God can't do otherwise at the next moment. He can't be subsequently otherwise. So how are you going to get God having free will if he's timeless?
Hmm.
So SCOTUS is like, hold my beer. I'll tell you a story, and so he's like, all right. So imagine in God's single timeless moment, there are embedded a series of logical moments.
Mm-hmm.
They look like they're temporal, but trust me, they're really not. So at this first moment, God's not doing anything. At the second logical moment, God's making up his mind. At the third logical moment, God's deciding stuff. It's all happening in a single timeless moment. But it's supposed to be this kind of way of telling a story exactly how God is, in fact, free.
Like putting into linear fashion for us so we can understand it. Is that what it's trying to communicate?
Well, that's actually where the debate gets weird. So It seems like SCOTUS is saying this is really going on in the life of God. This is real. This is not just in our understanding. But when you fast forward a few generations, when everybody, all the Calvinists, all the Arminians, all the Molinists, they're given like a million logical moments in the life of God. Like, I mean, like the number of logical moments they do to tell like the story of predestination and creation and all that, it gets absurd really fast. Like they just start growing.
Is it illogical? No pun intended.
No, well, some of it is illogical,
Yeah.
but they tell you like there's only two. No, there's only three moments, and then all of a sudden you're like, you've got 7, you've got 12, and you're like, what's going on? So when some different people get in trouble, and they're kind of question of like, I don't like the order of moments you put in the life of God. That doesn't look quite right. Here's what people would say in response. They'd be like, oh, well, these don't really apply to God. This is just in our understanding. This is the story we have to tell ourselves to get our theology straight. It's not real. It's not really in the life of God. And then you're like, then why is everybody so animated about coming up with the right logical order if it's not real? So I think people, when you look historically, they're going back and forth about, does this actually apply to God or is this only in our head? Molina seems to say both at various points. He seems to say it's in our understanding, but there's something in the reality that it kind of corresponds to maybe. And then later, other people in that same time period, they're like, yeah, this is real. And others are like, oh, I'm in trouble. No, it's not real. It's not real. I'm not a heretic.
Is it?
So, yeah.
Yeah. Is it kind of like, people will say, okay, this and that and this about God, but then when you press them on it, they revert back to the logical moments, like almost as if they don't want to commit or they can't commit because they don't really know.
So let me give you a concrete case of this, so you can kind of see what's going on. So there's this guy named Moses Amarat. He's a Calvinist.
Oh yeah, that 4 point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Amory
Hmm.
Alduinism? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how exactly how you're supposed to
Yeah,
say
I
it.
always have trouble.
Yeah, but Amarant, he comes up with a particular order of logical moments that looks really, really close to Arminianism. Well, but if you're a Calvinist, you don't want to be a dirty Arminian, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
like no one wants that.
Give me the
And so
cross
he,
symbol.
yeah, exactly. And so he gets in trouble, and and a bunch of people start questioning him about his work, saying like it looks like it's Arminianism. It's not the real Reformed theology of France. So what
Mm,
what are you doing here? And his response to this council that he has to appear before, he says, "Look, these are not real distinctions in God. These are just distinctions in our understanding, so that we can get our theology straight." And that satisfies the council. They're like, "Oh, okay, cool. You're not really, an Arminian because these distinctions don't apply to God."
hmm.
And so what you have here is a case of someone really trying to figure out what's going on in the life of God, and then when they get pushed on it and get accused of having the wrong views, oh well, I'm not really talking about God anymore.
Yeah, it
And
sounds like a cop out to me.
that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
So yeah, and there are times when I'm looking at some of theologians and they don't want to admit that it's a fiction. They think it's real, and it feels like a cop out. But then there's some Calvinists like Paul Helm, who's a
I
contemporary
was thinking of
Calvinist.
him too, actually.
Yeah, he's brilliant.
I read him. Yeah, same. He is, yeah, super smart.
Yeah, everything from him I love, and he looks at these logical moments and he wants to reject them because he thinks that it looks too much like divine temporality. He doesn't think that they really do what they say they're going to do. It doesn't really give you a story of how a timeless God can be free. So he wants to just reject them out of hand, saying they're not even. So even if it is a fiction, it's not a useful fiction because it's not really getting the job done of what it's supposed to. So there's a lot of opinions going all over the place about what these logical moments, if they're real or not real, what they're doing, are they even doing anything at all?
Yeah.
It's a bit of a mess.
Hmm. And I remember reading Paul Helm on Four Views in Time. I believe that's
Hmm.
the name of the book, and he goes to the point as you mentioned, where he thinks creation was eternal, and that contingency was just like an ontological contingency of hierarchical, some kind of order to it. But again, and even the Son, God the Son was always incarnate because there
Hmm.
is no like he wants to deny that temporality.
Yeah, it's the Helm goes to some pretty
Is it mind blown?
yeah, he goes to some pretty extreme lengths to try to save divine timelessness, and I don't think it does because his theory of time still entails that there's succession in the world, and God is really related to a world filled with succession. And then also, I think you end up losing the doctrine of creation out of nothing because you've got the universe being co-eternal with God, and that is exactly what creation out of nothing denies, and it's
Mhm.
exactly what the panentheist who denies creation out of nothing affirms.
Yeah.
So I think his view looks identical to what a lot of contemporary panentheists are saying. And in fact, they'll say, "Hey, Paul, that's what I've been saying all along. What do you mean you affirm
High
creation
five,
out of nothing?"
buddy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is funny because like sometimes Paul will do this too, where he'll look at like different people and he'll be like, "I know you say you're an open theist, but your view looks like it's Calvinism. Like welcome home, brother." He'll do this kind of stuff too. So yeah, it's good. It's good.
And not to confuse, our viewers, but is Molinism committed to an A theory of time or B theory of time? And if you can just explain those real
Mhm.
quick for our audience, just so they're not like, "What's that?"
Yeah. So it doesn't commit you to any view, as far as I can tell. But so an A theory says that there's something unique about the present moment. There's a lot of different ways you could try to capture that uniqueness. My preferred way is to say the present is the only moment of time that exists, and so that's why it's unique. So the present exhausts reality. But other atheists might say the past and the present exist, or all moments of time exist, but there's this like spotlight moving along that points out like what time it is now.
Hmm.
There's about like a combination of different views you can affirm. The B theory says there's nothing unique about the present. Uh, Typically, those will be people who affirm what's called eternalism, which is that all moments of time equally exist. They're all eternal. But I know a bunch of B theorists who also affirm presentism and affirm growing block, and like it gets messy
Wow.
because philosophy of time is a hot mess. But that's supposed to be the big idea. So usually when people talk about A theory, B theory, what they really mean or are interested in is presentism, only the present exists, or
Hmm.
eternalism, all the moments exist.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to Molinism, I want to say, well, Molina is a presentist, but
Oh,
that
okay, that's good
doesn't
to know.
I mean, yeah, pretty much everyone throughout church history is a presentist.
Oh, interesting.
It's not until you get to Einstein when people start kind of
Oh,
questioning
really?
this in the West. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
yeah. Every once in a while, like I'll see someone ask, like, "Hey, what about this guy?" And I'm like, no, 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 no. That's not. He's clearly says only the present moment exists. You know, it's right there. So yeah, so Emily Thomas, she's working on a book on the kind of the history of philosophy, and she thinks that nobody's even really interested in asking or even like questioning presentism until you get to just a bit before Einstein.
Wow.
So yeah, so historically, you know, people like Molina, they're presentists, but it's theoretically you could have Molinism and a B theory, or an eternalist account. That's what Ciro de Florio and Aldo Frigero do in their book Omniscience and Human Freedom. They articulate here's a way to understand Molinism, and they develop it on an eternalist ontology of time. So you've got options.
Historically, and I think I've heard, Molinists use this argument that pretty much everybody in church history, even though they weren't Molinists, they affirmed that God does have middle knowledge. Is that a fair assessment of of
I've
that church
I've
history
heard this
view?
before. Again, like I said before, the conceptual machinery to even identify this idea of middle knowledge, that just doesn't exist until you get to John Duns Scotus in the 1200s. I mean,
Mm.
the underlying modal logic there it's not developed, and the terminology and everything is just not there. I mean, the
Okay.
idea that God knows the future, like, yeah, I mean, yeah, of course. That's there in history, but you
Yeah.
don't see a lot of like well-developed accounts that look really like the kind of unique claims that Molinism wants to make. I just don't think you're going to find them there.
Okay. Well, and just to go back to what you said about Jacob Arminius, like he affirmed middle knowledge, which I guess I found that out a little while back too, and I was like, oh,
Hmm.
okay, that's interesting. But is a difference between like an Arminian, because I'm an Arminian too, and I hold a simple foreknowledge. Is the difference between like us and them, without skipping, kind of
Hmm.
getting too off track? Is it that Molinism just takes it as a theme? And then, that's like the overarching theme about how God works out his sovereignty and that reconciles human freedom.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean that's a good way to think about it. So all Molinism is really doing is going, here's a theory of providence.
Mm,
What exactly God does in history, in terms of like salvation and anything like that. Molinism is like, yeah, I don't know, whatever you want. Do you want penal substitution? I don't care. Do you want like a non-penal? I don't. What That's not my job. I'm just here to tell you, here's a basic framework for providence. Whatever theory of salvation you want to put in there, if you want to put some extra bells and whistles to identify the mechanisms by which God selects worlds, that's all there. Molinism is just the basic framework to do that.
okay. I think that's a good phrase. It's a basic framework. I think that
Mhm.
helps me understand it better too. Like, what Molinism is and everything.
Yeah,
It's a framework to mention. I think you said the sovereignty of God, right?
yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, moving on to, so what's the biblical case for this? Because I know a lot of this is like philosophical, but is there any biblical cases or examples that you could think of that Molinism tries to argue for and say, look, this is a prime example of this framework?
They do. This I'm not convinced of.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's a knockdown biblical case for Molinism, but I don't think that's a big deal because I don't think there's a knockdown biblical case for Calvinism or open theism either.
Hmm.
Because what you see in Scripture, this is what most scholars will agree on. When you look at Scripture as a whole, you see various themes. God's sovereign. He's doing providential stuff. He's
Yeah.
predestining something or other. And humans have some kind of freedom, and humans are morally responsible. Like those are like very clear biblical themes. What you have going on, though, I think, is with like Calvinism and Molinism and any of these other theories of providence. What they're trying to do is figure out what's the best way to capture all of those biblical themes in a nice, neat little package.
Hmm.
There are a couple of verses though that Molinists will try to point to say, "Hey, we've got something that really tilts like things our direction." So, like a first one is 1 Samuel 23. So you've got David is on the run, and King Saul is like trying to get him, like capture him, and God's like, David, look, if you go to this like town over here, those people, if Saul shows up, those people are going to hand you over to Saul.
Oh
So like
yeah.
it's like don't go there. And then you see something similar in Matthew 11:23. because they're like Jesus. He's like really annoyed at this town because they're not listening to him, and like he's like done some cool miracles, and people are just like, I don't know, I don't really care. And so you can understand like Jesus, he's not happy, and so he's like, look, if people of Sodom, like that's the city that God destroyed like way back in the day, if they would have saw me doing this miraculous stuff, they would have believed. They'd still be here today if they would have
Yeah,
saw this
yeah, I
sort of
remember
stuff.
that.
Yeah, like what's wrong with you guys?
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, like I think it's fair.
Yeah, yeah, I guess that I mean, it is, right? It sounds
Yeah,
like those are counterfactuals
exactly. And
in
so that's
in
what the
the real
Molinist
sense
says.
of
Mhm.
counterfactuals.
Yeah, because these are hypothetical, like, counterfactual
Yeah,
things. So yeah, exactly. And so that's what the Molinist is like, haha, right? See? But a Calvinist and an open theist can easily account for those because what the Molinist needs is to say God has this knowledge before he even decides to create anything at all. What we have in the First Samuel and the Matthew case is creation's already up and running. And so the Calvinists can go, right, yeah, God gets all this knowledge after, he freely decides to create a universe. Or the open theist goes, yeah, because you've got creatures who have very clear natures, and it's pretty obvious what they're going to do. These people over here, David, like they really don't like you. It's just obvious that if you go there, I know they're going to hand you over to Saul. And Jesus' statement, um, I mean, he seems like he probably knows the people of Sodom pretty well at this point. He's like, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, they would have, or it's just a condemnation sort of statement. Maybe it's not really trying to get too nitty gritty about like the semantics of counterfactuals. It's just like, you guys are garbage people. These people who are really awful, they would have figured it out. What's wrong? So it could be a different rhetorical sort of claim. So I don't think it really pushes you towards the Molinist position like quite clearly. It's not a slam dunk.
It sounds like to me like kind of like just like an anthropomorphic maybe language, or just like some kind of like analogy to prove to say like principle, like like you mentioned, like you're worthless people basically.
Mhm.
I think.
It might be because sometimes when you and I, when we speak in these counterfactual ways and these hypothetical ways, sometimes that's what we're up to. But then other times, no, like we really know certain things. Like I know if you give me the option of like, let's go to Wendy's to get a cheeseburger or let's go somewhere else. I mean, I'm probably going to say Wendy's because that's like my favorite, like, like place to get a cheeseburger.
Pretty
So
good.
yeah. So like there's certain things like you just know, and there's no fancy like Molinist kind of stuff going on with that. And so that's why it's difficult for me to say that these kind of passages are a slam dunk, because we can talk these ways and we know things in this way in our day-to-day lives, and that doesn't really get us all the way to something like middle knowledge.
Hmm. One of the things, I thought of too, as you were answering, what's a biblical case for Molinism? I remember you gave a great example on God's sovereignty, and you mentioned, I'm paraphrasing, but we can all basically agree that God's sovereignty, like all Molinists, Calvinists, Arminians, all agree that God's sovereignty means God has the ability to plan something and then accomplish that plan.
Mhm.
I don't know if you remember that, but yeah, but I thought that was a pretty good definition of what is God's sovereignty in this. You don't have to go off track, but
Yeah.
just to mention that.
Yeah, no, that is important because it took me years to figure out what sovereignty is. So I wrote a paper, I think it was published in 2014. It's
Yeah.
called Is God the Prisoner of the Oldest Dimension? It's this prisoner of time objection. Like if God's in time, is he not really sovereign? Is the problem. And I was like, well, what's sovereignty? And I couldn't find a good definition from like anyone. I even found this book that was like 6 views on sovereignty, and not a
Sick.
single person in there
Ooh.
defined the word. And I'm just like, what is this? And then I found this guy named Arthur W. Pink. He's a Calvinist from like the
Oh,
early
yeah, yeah.
from the early 1900s. And I normally like I think he's a really good writer, but he's got this treatise on the sovereignty of God, and he's like, the sovereignty of God is the very godness of God.
What does that even mean?
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm like, this is worthless. This is garbage. Thank you. Thank you for nothing. So what I eventually developed was something kind of like the definition that you just gave, and then I found a couple Calvinists from Princeton in the early 1900s who had something kind of similar to this, and then T.J. Mawson at Oxford. He's got a similar account of this. So yeah, the idea is God's sovereignty. That's not like essential to who God is, because if God doesn't create anything, what is he sovereign over? Like himself? No. You are sovereign if you decide to perform some sort of action for a reason, and you're able to actually accomplish that. You've got the ability. So what's essential to God is his power, his freedom, his knowledge. And then if God decides, I want to create a universe for a particular purpose, and I want to actually bring that purpose to fruition, then now you can start talking about God being sovereign, because he's got something he's ruling over to bring about his purpose. So yeah, I think that's what the Calvinists are going to be like. Yeah, that's cool. Molinists should be able to
Yeah.
say the same thing, and open theists should say the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there really is, definition. I think that we can all be like, yeah, I think that's a good, good definition. Because
Hmm.
even too, like I understand God's sovereignty as something that He does, and rather than it being an attribute, I understand God is omnipotent. He's all powerful, and then
Right.
sovereignty is just a working out of that omnipotence, and
Yeah.
doing again like making a plan and accomplishing and seeing it through, and being able to do that as
Yeah.
well. So I think
Yeah.
that's a great definition.
Yeah.
How does this, I know we talked about this before too, but
Mhm.
just diving a little bit more into this, how does this compare to like Calvinism? And maybe by Calvinism we mean like determinism,
Mhm.
and then if you could maybe go into the Arminian simple foreknowledge view, and then just touch on the cherry on top, open theism.
Mhm.
A lot to talk about. Just
Yeah.
talk
So
about it all, Ryan.
yeah, let's do everything. Why not? So let's start with simple foreknowledge view.
Okay.
This is the view that I like the least. So sorry,
Ah,
because I know you
well,
love it.
that's
Um,
okay.
so there's some really good papers on this. So William Hasker has a paper called "Simple Foreknowledge is Still Providentially Useless,"
Hmm.
and then Frugero and Chiro, they have a paper. I forget the exact title because it's in Italian, but it's basically like, yeah, it's still really useless,
Hmm.
but this time in Italian. So so here's the idea. So you get that moment of natural knowledge where God just knows all the logical possibilities, and the simple foreknowledge view says God doesn't know the future at all until after the universe comes into existence. So it's kind of bizarre. So the claim is something like this. It's like God's like, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to snap my fingers, and the universe will go bang, and then I'll see what's happening.
Hmm.
So he snaps his fingers, the universe goes bang, and God's like, what's going to happen? Oh, that's what's going to happen. Hey, ooh, okay, gonna have to die on a cross. All right. So at that point, what's going to happen is settled, and God's foreknowledge doesn't help him with whatever's going to happen, because all he's just discovering this is what's happening. The simple foreknowledge view is supposed to help you get a nice account of freedom and foreknowledge, how humans have free will because God's not determining everything. But it's hard to figure out how God has any providential control, because God's just seeing, oh, this is what's happening. And he'd be like, well, he knows the future. I'm like, yeah, but so what? There's no control there. Think of it this way. So imagine you're walking along the beach and you see a little cave, and so you start walking and want to explore the cave.
Yeah.
And you go in there and you see that there's this little book in there that's called the abbreviated or the abridged version book of the world,
Hmm.
because
Okay.
because the full book of the world would be massive. This is
Enormous.
just
Yep.
this is an abridged version. So you open it up and you see written there, it's describing you on the beach and walking into this cave and everything, and you get kind of freaked out and you scream like, oh, okay, Pale, and you throw it across to the other side of the cave. And you calm down and you go and you pick up the book and you're looking again and you see like it sees right there, like, it describes you like swearing in Italian, and then like carrying on and reading it, and then you see your entire life written out of all the big highlights of what's going to happen. You now have foreknowledge. That foreknowledge though can't help you in terms of having any sort of control over the future, because what's going to happen is already written, it's already settled, so
I
you
see what
don't
you're
have any
saying.
control. Yeah, and so that's the main objection to simple foreknowledge is there's
Okay.
no providential control.
Kind of
So
like you throw
sure,
the
God,
dice and like the dice are just going to land no matter
yeah,
what, and
yeah,
knowing that dice what it's going to land on is doesn't change the fact that it's going to land on say 6.
exactly. Yeah,
Okay. Gotcha.
yeah, and so that's the main objection to the simple foreknowledge
Okay.
view. Yeah.
Cool. And then compared to Calvinism or determinism, I don't know if, if you think that that's a fair assessment, like Calvinism, determinism. I don't know if you have a better
Mhm.
definition.
Well, so yeah, because theological determinism is the claim that how does God know the future? Well, he knows the future because he's going to causally determine everything that happens.
Yeah.
And so theological determinism is just this sort of story of, yeah, God directly causes everything that happens.
Hmm.
And you've got causal power too. God directly causes you to cause things, and somehow you get free will. From there, though, you've got different sort of stories you can tell. So your average Calvinist is going to say theological determinism, yes, But human freedom is compatible with theological determinism. So they're going to have theological determinism, that basic framework, and they're going to add some bells and whistles on top of it. And so what you're supposed to be able to get, again, this is just what you're supposed to be able to get, according to the Calvinist, you get a risk-free account of providence. There's no worry that God's going to going to fail to satisfy his purposes. He's not going to get screwed, like history's not going to get screwed up or anything like that,
Hmm.
because God's causally determining everything that's going to happen. What he says goes. And you supposedly get free will because freedom is compatible with being causally determined. Freedom could be something like a reasons account of freedom. You are free in the sense that you act on behalf of reasons. You do the things you want to do. Sure, God causes you to want those things, and God causes you to have the reasons that you have, and God causes your actions to exist and causes you to act in the ways that you do. But you're still doing what you want to do, so you're free. So what's the big deal? So
Yeah.
God's got all the providential control you'd ever want, and creatures have a kind of freedom, and they could do otherwise. They really could do otherwise if God decided to cause them to do otherwise.
Yeah.
So yeah, you've got all the freedom you could want.
Yeah. It's the overarching theme of just,
Mhm.
determinism, really,
Yeah.
even though they try to say, oh, it's libertarian free will. And, and there's different views on
Well,
that too, on what that
it's not
actually looks like.
libertarian free will. So yeah, we
Oh,
should
sorry.
define that. I did.
Yeah. What do they call it? Compatibilism?
Well, kind of. So here's the idea. So when you're looking at free will, first you just go, what is free will? And some people will go, you're the source of your action and you've got the ability to do otherwise. Not everyone is interested in that ability to do otherwise. Historically, most of the early Calvinists and everything do want that ability to do otherwise. Today, not as much. But you just define whatever free will is. Then there's another question to ask. Is free will compatible with being causally determined? If you say yes, then you're a compatibilist. If you say no, then you've got a few more questions to ask, because you might say determinism exists and therefore there's no free will in the world. Or you could say there is no determinism, there is free will. And that's what a libertarian's going to say. So freedom is not compatible with being determined, and there is freedom in the world.
Hmm.
So that's what. So a Calvinist is going to go, there is free will, it is compatible with being determined.
Gotcha.
But free
Okay.
will is still just whatever free will is, or however you define it.
Okay. And then last but not least, open theism. How does this compare? And then what is open theism?
So open theism, they'll go, okay, remember that moment of natural knowledge. God
Yeah.
knows all the logical possibilities.
Yeah.
What the open theist says is when God decides to create a particular universe, he really wants creatures who have this robust libertarian freedom, because they go, you can't get freedom that's compatible to determinism. That's just not possible. That's not on the cards. So God has to create a universe that where creatures have real freedom, libertarian freedom, and that entails that the future is completely open. That is not determined what in fact will happen. There's no story of the world. But God knows all the logically possible things that could happen, and he knows the objective probabilities of all the different things happening. And what God does before he creates a universe is he comes up with an exhaustive contingency plan to guarantee that he is going to satisfy his purposes for creation. So this is how Richard Rice and Gregory Boyd will talk and say, this is what we mean as open theists, what we mean by predestination, is that before God creates, he's got this exhaustive contingency plan that he can guarantee that he's going to satisfy whatever his purposes are for creation. What open theism does, though, a lot of times is they'll talk about how it's sort of risky. So some will say it's a legitimate risk that God's purpose might not come to fruition. Like there's a legitimate risk that God could fail. Others will go, no, that's nuts. God's not an idiot. He's going to figure this out. But the risk is that God's definitely going to, whatever his purposes are for creation, he's going to get that. But the risk is how much evil and how much suffering and how much terrible stuff happens along the way. That's what the risk is. I prefer that version of open theism compared to the other one where it's everything could really, really get, it's possible God could completely fail miserably. And I'm like, really? I don't think so. But if that's what you want as an open theist, go for it. But
Yeah. I didn't know the open theists make that distinction, or some do, between God failing versus God risking. That's
yeah. So it's this bizarre distinction. that labels that have become developed are high risk and low risk open theism, or sorry, high risk and limited risk open theism.
Hmm.
And my wife and I, my wife's a molecular biologist, and so we wrote a paper on, if the God of open theism exists, what kind of universe would you expect God to create?
Hmm.
And we look at all these risk management systems that exist in the molecular world, and we're like, well, that seems like the kind of world that God would want to create, because these open theists, their talk about risk is really confused. They seem to be contradicting themselves all the time. Let's clean up the mess for them, and try to defend this view as best as we can. So that's what we try to do in that, in a paper we wrote, is try to get rid of,
Huh.
clean up what the risk is involved. But some open theists really loved it. Some others told us like, no, I want all the risk. And I'm like, okay, that's fine.
What would you say to this? It's one of my, I guess theories on this, and just to run it by you. I always say that Calvinism has more in common with open theism because they'll usually make the claim that Arminians are, consistent Arminians is open theism, and I always like to point out how both the Calvinists and the open theists admit that God can only know the future if He ordains the future. Or and I say the objection is the Arminian is the only one who will disagree with that. And really what that means is we put them on the table together. Calvinism agrees more with open theism than they do with Arminianism. So, so I just want to see if you think that's accurate or what you think about
Mhm.
that.
Oh yeah, I think that's very accurate. So
Okay.
what you see in like Francis Turretin, so he's like one of these Protestant scholastics. He's a Calvinist,
Hmm.
and he's super explicit because there's something like open theism is being hotly debated at that point. So this is like what, 1700s. So because open theism has a actually pretty old history that most people don't know, and so Francis Turretin, he just hates it. He just goes, yeah, if you want to ascribe to creatures this robust kind of libertarian freedom, it's impossible for God to know the future,
Oh,
and
so he
things will just
admits
go
it.
all, yeah, and he'll just be like, yeah,
Wow.
so therefore it goes all wild and weird and crazy. Well,
Hmm.
God's not an idiot like that. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't. So he's going to causally determine everything. Like this is what like Turretin argues.
Huh.
So I think it's super explicit in different time periods when you look at different Calvinists that they are really have a lot of agreement with open theists. And you see the same thing today, where the average Calvinist and the average open theist will go, middle knowledge is impossible. Like you Molinists, you're like, your options really are either our view or
They'll
their view.
deny middle knowledge open theists. I didn't really know that.
Mhm. Yeah, because they'll say if creatures really have this robust kind of freedom, there just is no fact of the matter about what they would do in any possible circumstance. God could know the logical possibilities. He knows what you might do, but what you would in fact do, no, no.
Would that mean then that like the counterfactuals are kind of like, as an illustration, like looking on like TV screens and like seeing this counterfactual, that counterfactual, kind of like if you remember the movie The Matrix, where Neo
Mhm.
finally makes it to the architect and he sees all these screens around him
Yeah.
and they do all like he's like different lives. Is that like kind of the difference between the open theist saying, well, there are logical possibilities, but they're not counterfactuals. Like, where counterfactuals are actually the I guess real world examples, God viewing it on a television screen. Just, again, just as an illustration. Is that kind of like the difference between that two?
It's kind of like that. So think of it like this. So you're a big Hollywood producer,
Okay.
and you've got all these scripts sitting on your table. And these are like scripts that you could really turn into a movie or a TV show or something like that. Uh, some scripts, they're fully written out. There's no logical contradiction in them, but that doesn't really tell you if that's a feasible movie to make or a feasible TV show to make. Because it
Hmm.
might be like, yeah, there's this logically consistent story. There's no plot holes or anything like that. But like the characters are so unbelievable. Like you're just like, no one would do that. Because all you have is just the mere, this is a possibility. This is a possible script. The Molinist wants to say there are certain subset of those scripts, those movie scripts and TV scripts that
Hmm.
describe this, that they're feasible. This is like what creatures actually would do if with free will, and like a really robust kind of freedom. Whereas the open theist goes, no, no, God's options are reality TV shows. They can be heavily scripted, but there's still all this like spontaneity and stuff in it. How spontaneous do you want to go? I don't know. It could be like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, where they figured out next season you guys are going to get married. How are we going to get there? I don't know. We'll figure that out later. But you guys go out there on set right now and propose. But there's a lot of improv going on, but it's
Hmm.
set within some kind of boundaries. So the open theists want to go, God's options are to create reality TV shows. Whereas a Calvinist and a Molinist are going to go, no, there's some other kind of things you can make.
Okay, that makes sense. I think when you use the word counterfactuals of what you would actually do.
Mhm.
Gotcha. Okay, I think I'm understanding that difference between the theist, the open theist, and the Molinist now.
Mhm.
Just to a question you or ask a question on simple foreknowledge. Would
Mhm.
you say that dilemma where like the example I used was God throwing the dice. If it's going to land on 6, God can't change that. He's just going to know that. Would that dilemma change if there was middle knowledge implemented into that? Like, do you think like James Arminius would kind of not soften it, but like throw the middle knowledge into that objection? Well, God, yes, he does know it in that sense, but there's also middle knowledge, and would that change things?
Mhm. Yeah, because what you have is before God decides to create anything, he can actually figure out what the feasible options are, and he selects that's the timeline that I do want.
Okay, and
Whereas
and would
on
that
this
make you a
on the
Molinist then?
that would make you a Molinist, yeah, because on the simple
Okay.
foreknowledge view, so this is what gets confusing when you're reading the literature. So so Molinism doesn't give you an answer to how freedom and foreknowledge are compatible. Like it doesn't give you an answer to that.
Hmm.
Whereas the simple foreknowledge view is supposed to do that. Sometimes it's called Ockhamism, named after like William of Ockham.
Okay.
And so what Molinism can do is they can say, I can take that answer to the freedom foreknowledge problem. But if your whole story is just the simple foreknowledge view, then you don't get providence. So Molinism, something like what Arminius seems to what he wants to do, is because he's got the benefit of being after all these other people, after Molina, after Occam and whatnot.
Yeah.
He's like, well, okay, fine, that's fine. I'll give the Molinist story for providence, and then, well, what about freedom and foreknowledge? Ooh, okay. Well, the simple foreknowledge view, like whatever Occam said, that gets you out of the problem. Like that's like a strategy you could do.
Okay. So I mean, maybe more people are Molinists than we actually think, and without
Most
even knowing it,
likely,
right? That's what it
yeah.
kind of seems like. If because I feel like a lot of people tend to go down that route, and maybe they don't. Again, like they don't even know it, but it's
Mhm.
just what they're kind of affirming.
Yeah, because whenever I go back and reread like David Hunt's work on simple foreknowledge view,
Oh
I'm
yeah.
always like surprised to go, oh right, this is the view. Like God doesn't know what's going to happen, and then he just sees, oh, this is everything that's going to happen, and we're like, well, how do you get the providential control? And you're like, let me throw in some causal loops and some weird sci-fi stuff, and I'm like, no, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't help. So I'm always like constantly surprised, like, oh right, this is really how radical the view is. It really is a very different kind of animal
Hmm.
from like Calvinism and Molinism and open theism.
I don't know if you read. Are you familiar with Robert E? I think I pronounced his last name Peccarilli. He's a classical Arminian.
I have not read his. He's got this his new book out on
Yeah.
providence. It's on my list, but I've not gotten to it yet.
Yeah, same. Yeah, like I want to read that. I think it's called God, like a new perspective of God and time or something.
Something like, or I think it's like God and Eternity, something like that. Yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No,
So
it
I'm
looks
interested to
interesting,
see.
but
I think he affirms the simple foreknowledge view, but then he talked about middle knowledge, and that's where I learned about the James Arminius holds the
mhm.
middle or held to a form of middle knowledge. So I'm wondering if he is trying to work those things out there.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, same.
All I can
Maybe.
say is it's on my to read list. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
same.
can't comment further.
What are the common objections to Molinism? And then you mentioned too, like you lean strongly towards Molinism, but you don't hold it. So just kind of like pulling that out a little bit more.
Yeah,
What are some of the things that you think personally are objections?
yeah. So I'll list the two big objections that bother me, and these are pretty common objections though. So the first one is what's called the grounding objection,
Oh
and then the
yeah.
second one is related to freedom and the settled future. So let's do the grounding objection first.
Okay.
Um, so the grounding objection is focusing on, is middle knowledge possible? Again, think about like God hasn't created a universe at all. So there's just God all along. What makes it true that this is what Ryan would do in all these possible circumstances? Because I don't even exist yet. So it can't be me that makes these things true.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's not supposed to be God's will that makes them true. Molinism explicitly denies that. So it's just like, well, what makes these things true? The force of the objection is relying on this thing called truth maker theory. And so truth maker theory says you have to point out something in the world that makes all the propositions have whatever their truth value is. So what makes it true that Ryan and Lucas are talking right now? Well, you and I are here, we're talking,
Yeah.
and that
In God's
makes the
world.
proposition true. Exactly. So there has to be something in reality that you can point to say that's the thing that makes this proposition true or false.
Hmm.
So that is what's underlying this objection, is going, okay, well, when it's just God all alone, you and I don't exist. So like what's the stuff that makes it true? The kind of standard answers people will give is that your essence makes it true. And I want to go, no, because your essence is just your set of essential properties.
Yeah, then what's
Like,
holding that essence up?
yeah, this was just an idea in the mind of God.
Oh.
And so God's got an idea of what you are, and what you could be. How do you get from the could to the would is the problem. And the claim is like, well, God's got this super amazing, awesome intuition that he can just intuit this is what you would do. I'm not sure if that really avoids like problems for determinism, or if that really makes any sense. I think what you should do instead is reject truth maker theory.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, and that might sound wild, but
Yeah.
actually, it's not anymore.
Don't tell
So
William
go,
Lane Craig.
yeah, yeah, because like, yeah, Craig's like, what, like, even like my friend Alan Rhoda, he's an open theist. He was like, no, you can't do this. And I'm like, okay, well, hang on. So over the last like 10 years or so, there's been a growing number of people who have gone, truth maker theory like is wild. It's supposed to be this like really like intuitive royal road to truth. Like it's supposed to help us like navigate like this theory is false, this other metaphysical theory is true, because it can find the truth makers. And what people keep pointing out, people who have no theological axe to grind, people who have no interest in God, as far as I can tell, are continually going, this doesn't make any sense. So it can't, truthmaker theory cannot handle things like negative existentials. So the claim, there are no unicorns. What's the thing that you can point out in reality that says that makes that true? And it can't be, well, there's because you can't point to unicorns because there aren't any of those. And so you're like, okay, well, great. You can't handle something like that.
Hmm.
What about 2 + 2 = 4? What makes that true? And you're like, well, nothing. Like it just is true. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. What makes that true? And you're like, that's just the way. That's just what happened. And like, well, but what's the thing that I can point to? And be like, no. There's no thing that I can point. That's just what happened. So Jonathan Talent has a more recent book called Truth and the World, where he goes through and just goes, truth maker theory cannot accommodate even the most common sense things.
Hmm.
Get rid of it. For Fabrice Correa and Sven Rosenkrantz, Bradley Monton, Brian Kierland, and Ulrich Mayer, people who have wildly radical different views on the nature of time and who have nothing to say about God or theology, all go, this truthmaker stuff just cannot work. And then even open theists like Patrick Todd also reject truthmaker theory because they think it just cannot accommodate really obvious truths, like truths about the past.
Who came up with this theory?
Truthmaker theory, I don't know the entire history of it.
Yeah.
It's what really got it up and running is this book by D.M. Armstrong. What was that in late 90s, early 2000s? I forget exactly
Okay,
when
so
it was.
kinda
It's just
early
called
then?
what?
So this truthmaker theory is kinda new or
It's kind of new, but you can easily find something in the neighborhood and previous
Gotcha.
generations. But like really getting focused on it as like a hot topic in
Hmm.
metaphysics is kind of like late 90s, early 2000s,
Okay.
when you see it really come where people really get super focused on it. You've got grounding objections that predate that, but
Mm.
this huge explosion in literature just saying, what is the truth making project? This
Yeah.
is like seems it gets really up and running with D.M. Armstrong's work. But the objections are already there, like in the 70s and the 60s and stuff. But now you're starting to see people go, truth maker theory is not all it's wrapped up to be. It seems like it gives us a lot of counterintuitive stuff. And so Trenton Merrick's, he also has a book that he wrote called Truth and Ontology, where he gives a lot of these kind of objections saying truth maker theory doesn't work. And he's a theist and he's also a Molinist. And so he's like, I've got this nice, sweet application for rejecting this, and
Yeah, that's
it's a
interesting.
theology. So you do see some, like at least one person who has a theological axe to grind. He's applying it to these things, but other people who have no interest in theology, they're just going, just get rid of truth maker theory.
What's your
It's good.
alternative to that? You said you had a different view?
Yeah, so Jonathan Talent, he develops what he calls an explanationist account of truth, and just it being like that's just the way the world was. That's just the way the world is. What makes 2 + 2 = 4? Well, that's just how things are. Like it's explained by that truth is explained by the fact that that's just how things are.
Hmm.
There's no deeper story. There's no like weird like mystical thing of like like no, it's just why is it true that unicorns do not exist? And you're like because there just aren't any unicorns. I don't need a thing that exists to make that true. Like it's just there just aren't any. It's just explained by the way the world is. The world just is such that Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States. There's no deeper story to tell.
Hmm. Okay.
So, and then same thing with like Patrick Todd, who's an open theist. His new book on the open future, he gives these similar kind of arguments. Going like, once a truth has been made true, like it can't be undone. Like, what a bizarre world that would be. So,
Yeah, I'm trying to
yeah,
think
so
think that through. Hmm.
yeah, so imagine like you think your eternalism is true, and so there's just like this eternal block of time. This is the space-time universe, and all the moments are there. Then imagine that the universe just ceases to exist, and then there's nothing that exists at all. So this is a thought experiment from John Leslie, who's an eternalist, and he goes, "Well, surely it would still be the case that the universe did exist. Like just because like all of the whole like space time realm just ceases to exist, that I mean, that can't undo the fact that there was a universe." And so Leslie, who is an eternalist, he just goes, "Truth maker theory just cannot capture this really obvious intuition." And Patrick Todd runs a similar kind of argument. And I think that's right. It just seems like wow, you can't capture something as obvious as that.
I think I
Something else is going
heard
on.
though William Lane Craig when he talked about that because he did a debate with James White. I don't know if you caught that debate.
Oh, I did watch that one. Yeah,
Yeah, more like a conversation that like was like happened for like 1 hour and that was
yeah,
it.
yeah,
They needed an official one, really.
yeah.
But he he used a truth maker theory, and I heard that. But I think he said the same thing, like like what makes unicorns not existent. And he says, well, they just are, and like you don't need a grounding. So isn't the explanation theory kind of the same thing as the truth maker theory?
A,
Like
l- a
is it
little bit.
different?
It's different though because what Craig is doing is what a lot of people do with truthmaker theory, is because truthmaker cannot account for these negative existentials and it cannot account for necessary truths. So what most people do is they'll go, let's just limit the scope of what truthmaker is meant to do. It's only meant to accommodate these contingent facts. And Jonathan Talent, what he keeps doing is he goes like, "Whoa, whoa! You told me the truthmaker theory is like this royal road to truth. It just like tells us like it does like it's the foundation for all of our metaphysics." And now you're like, "I don't know how to deal with these objections, so I'm going to ad hoc, kind of like narrow the scope." And he's like,
Hmm.
"Why?" And then he keeps poking and poking until you've narrowed the scope so much that it just seems like it just feels utterly arbitrary. Like, why did I narrow the scope to just this point, other than to deal with objections? So what Craig's working with is a restricted account of truthmaker theory, but that's what most people are doing. Jonathan Talent just goes, "Why would you do that? Like you've got this incredibly ad hoc theory now. This just feels like this cobbled mess.
Hmm.
No, just get rid of it."
It sounds like we're getting into epistemologies when when you try to talk about these things. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like a form of foundationalism where they start from these set of assumptions and they assume it's validity, and then from there try to work their way through these inferentials as they call them. I
Mhm.
don't I don't know what you think about that.
I could kind of see the parallel there. 'Cause truthmaker theory is supposed to be a metaphysical thesis primarily. You do have to start asking the question, like, how do I like find these little doodads that exist in the world?
Yeah.
But the truthmaker theory is primarily supposed to be this is like a foundational principle that we use to weed out metaphysical theories. Is what it's supposed to be.
Hmm,
What
okay.
it usually turns out is you have to start feeding in all sorts of wild metaphysical claims in order to satisfy it, and it's just like it gets weird really fast.
Hmm. And then are you still trying to, work through that and understand that objection more to Molinism? Like, that truth maker theory? Like, are you still trying to come to like an understanding and like that maybe that's what's holding you back from fully committing to Molinism?
Yeah, that's one of the issues. So I feel confident that I can get rid of truthmaker theory. Then what I still have this intuition though of going, so why is it the case that I would do freely do this or that in any circumstance? And what Trent Merrick says is like, it's just a bunch of facts. That's just what you would do. There's no deeper story. And I'm like, okay, I guess if you're a Molinist, that's what you have to say if you give up truthmaker theory. You'd be like, yeah, there's no deeper story
What if
here.
you want to know? Like,
Yeah, but that's the thing is like I've got this intuition of going like it feels like there's more to the story.
yeah,
And what you're
same.
gonna have to say is go, no, I don't care what your feelings are. There's no deeper story. And that feels somewhat unsatisfying.
I
I
know.
but I don't have this. What the truthmaker theory does though is it comes in and goes, you feel that dissatisfaction. I've got a story for why it's not satisfying. I don't have that story now because I've got rid of the truthmaker theory. So all I'm left with is this. Oh God, it feels like there's got to be more to the story, and that's all. But that's not an objection exactly.
Yeah, you got to keep going. I
Mhm.
guess keep
Yeah,
finding out. Like, man, like what's at the other side of this?
yeah. So that's the one problem. The other problem is freedom, human and divine, because I think there's this bizarre tension in the Molinist story. And so Alfred Freddoso, he's the one who gave us the English translation of Molina's theory of predestination and providence.
Hmm.
And so he's a top Molinist scholar. He said, so what I'm about to point out, he says this is the weakest link in Molinism. So remember, I said at that moment of natural knowledge, it is completely unsettled what God is going to do. Like
Yeah.
God hasn't even decided,
Yep.
is he going to create or not create? Like the story is just not written. It's completely unsettled. And what Molina says is if it were settled what God was going to do before God decided to create, before he made that decision to create or not create, if it was settled, God doesn't have free will. And I'm like, okay, but before I come into existence, it's completely settled what I'm going to do before I decide anything. But I still have free will? And Molina's like, yeah. And I'm like, no, hang on. If it'd be a problem for God's freedom, why is it not a problem for my freedom? Because I'm supposed to have the same kind of freedom that God does. The story is not adding up here.
Molina said that, or
Yes, Molina says this,
really? Wow.
and then you see some other people try to figure this out, try to tease this out. Jonathan Lang, and Kirk McGregor both have some writings on this to try to defend this point from Molina.
Just to clarify that, so Molina said in predestination that there was a point where God didn't have free will, like he had to create this by necessity.
Oh no.
Oh,
No, the
gotcha.
claim
Okay.
is if so God's like, I don't know if I'm going to create or not create. And it is not settled at all. There are no facts of the matter about what God's going to do. If there were facts about what God's going to do, if he's going to create or not create, if he's going to create that world instead of this world, if there were actual settled facts before God makes a decision, then God would not have any free will.
Hmm.
So there are no facts about what God's going to do prior to God just making a decision.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
It's still an interesting point to think about.
Yeah.
If this and that.
Yeah. So think about the abridged Book of the World case earlier. So what you would have is if God like stumbled upon the Book of the World and was like, oh gosh, that's what I'm going to do, then he wouldn't have free will on
Okay,
Molina's
that
account.
makes sense. Gotcha.
So what Molina's saying is there just is no book until God makes a decision,
So
and
he
then the
writes
book
the
is
book.
written. Yes, in a sense,
Gotcha.
because you want to throw in some other bells and whistles, but yeah. So in a sense, God decides this is the book, and if there was a book before God makes the decision, then God has no free will. And what's weird is, well, there's a book now, and I didn't have any choice about writing it. I just find myself in the book, and I don't. But I'm supposed to have like this really robust freedom, the same kind of like robust freedom God has. But it would be a problem. But it's not a problem for me. But it's a problem for God. Like there's a weird parallelism that doesn't. It's just not matching up here.
Okay. So yeah. So it's not like reconciling, I guess.
Yeah, because I'm like, if this is a problem for God's freedom, then it should be a problem for my freedom too. Is the worry that I have, and it's a worry that a lot of people have.
Is that kind of going back into like the simple foreknowledge view then a little bit? Like almost like that, like you're ending up at that same point.
Yes.
Because if
Yeah.
God knows it, then that's kind of it.
Yeah, exactly. The way Kirk McGregor tries to defend it in his new book, um, I feel like he kind of misses the point because Molina's like, it's got to be an unsettled future for God. It's got to be open for God. Oh, the way Kirk tries to like defend it is to identify a different principle, which is if you foreknew your own actions, then you wouldn't be free. So God doesn't foreknow his own actions. But if I foreknow your actions, That's no big deal because my foreknowledge doesn't cause you to do whatever you're doing. And the same thing with God. God's foreknowledge doesn't cause you to do whatever you're doing. And I'm going to go, okay, well, let's pray that God never tells us what we're going to do, because then we won't have free will. So like the only reason we have free will is because God's like, oh, I want to tell you, but I'm not gonna, because then you wouldn't be free. And I'm like, that's no. The problem is not whether or not God tells you what you're going to do. The problem is that the future is settled. And that's what Molina saw would be the problem for God. And I want to go, if that's a problem for God, it's going to be a problem for us.
See, now I'm thinking of what Robert E. Piccirilli, again, about, I think I'm pronouncing that right. He made a distinction, and I'm referring to his book, Grace, Faith, and Free Will.
Okay.
And he talked about how in an event is the certitude of an event is different from the contingency of it. And he says certitude is referring to the knowledge, the fact of it, where the contingency is referring to the nature. So he makes the point that God can know the future with certitude of a contingent event. So even though it could have been otherwise, and there were counterfactuals surrounding it, that doesn't detach from the fact that God had certitude about that actuality, even though it's nature contingent. Would that solve that problem for you? You think? I'm sure you thought about that.
I
too.
had thought about this a lot because Calvinists and Molinists, they all make this claim that it's inevitable, it's certain that you're going to do X or Y or Z, whatever, but it's not necessary. When you dig deep into the details of how this is supposed to go, when you're looking at the medieval accounts of the contingency of the world that this is based upon. So again, going back to my earlier point of why I don't think you can have Molinism prior to Scotus, because Scotus gives us this conceptual machinery that we need for this kind of stuff. There are certain counts of what exactly is the contingency of the world grounded in. And the contingency of the world is grounded in God's free will. Because whatever God decides to create, that's exactly how it's going to go. And so it really has to be the case that God's free to do A or not A, to create or not create, to say that world or that world, or that multiverse or this other multiverse. Like it's supposed to be, that's what grounds the contingency of the world. Because once God decrees that something's going to be, that's how it's got to go. So this sort of certainty, but not necessary. The claim is our actions, your actions, my actions, they are hypothetically necessary or conditionally necessary, but they're not absolutely necessary. They're necessary based on some prior contingent conditions. Those prior contingent conditions are God's decision to create or not create, and to create that world instead of this world. So when you're tracing back the root of contingency of the world, it's supposed to go back to God's free will. And what Molina sees really, really clearly is if God doesn't have that actual ability to do A or not A, to create or not create, then you lose the entire contingency of the universe and everything becomes absolutely necessary. So that's part of the baggage, the intellectual like problems that Molina's got in his mind and he's trying to deal with. So this kind of distinction of it's certain but not necessary, Molina's like, yeah, that's too late in the game. I've got these prior issues that I've got to deal with. So that wouldn't help him out.
Do you and are you still assuming or do you still hold to the B theory of time? I'm sorry, the A theory of time?
As far as the A theory is a meaningful, like A theory, B theory is a meaningful distinction. A lot of times I question if it is, but I do affirm like a presentist ontology of time, that the present is
not
the
like
only
this
moment that
cube,
exists.
like the cube view where everything's just out there, and this is just sliced between moments and not actual
I think that's
temporal
a
moments.
disaster for Christian theology. I've written a bunch of papers on this, just going like, you don't get life after death. Evil coexists with God for all of eternity. You can't get rid of it. I think it's a disaster for Christian theology to affirm this like sort of block view of time.
I held to that for a little bit, but then I started getting more into it. And even now, look, there's so much to talk about when you talk about God and time.
Oh yeah,
and everything. It's like, I think one of the things that I do know is that we don't really know a lot what we talk about on this issue.
Yeah,
and even like even the people who think they know what they're talking about, I'm always like, you don't actually know this either. I feel like we're in the same boat a lot of times.
Yeah, because at this point now I've written 2 books on God and time. The second one hasn't been published yet, but it's coming out. And whenever I look at this now, I'm like, I spent a long number of years like trying to figure this stuff out. And when I read Your Average Theologian, I'm like, you don't have a clue what time is. And
Yeah.
you really don't know what you're talking about. And then I look at myself going, when it comes to like theories of atonement or like ethics or stuff like that, I'm like, I don't have a clue what I'm talking about there because I haven't like spent anywhere near the amount of study that's required. So yeah, I think most people just don't know what they're talking about in general, because it's difficult to really study something. And even then, like time is just one of these weird things where like your average philosopher of time doesn't even know what time is, and
I
they're
know.
really upfront about that. They don't even like want to like ask that question. And
It's
I'm
so
like,
interesting though, this subject.
mm-hmm.
Like, I
Oh yeah,
studied it
science,
once
great.
or twice, and it's like, sometimes I could look my head, like, literally hurts trying to
Mm-hmm.
think about, all these theories and all these views and, just getting to the place where it's like, again, like, I don't really know a lot of what is real about time and, like,
Mm-hmm.
what is God's relationship to time and what does the Bible say? And, like, and all these things are intertwined with it, like truth maker theory.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, man, like, I feel like we're all in the same boat. Like,
Yeah.
not that everybody's equally and, like, we all just coexist, because I do believe there's a truth to this.
Yeah.
But
But in terms of like figuring it out, I mean, it's a vast network of concepts and interrelated problems. And then when we bring it to do systematic theology, you start seeing, oh my goodness, this really is a system of ideas, and how do they hang together? And you
yeah,
start fiddling with one and realize, oh gosh, it doesn't fit with this. Oh well, the traditional view didn't fit with that either. Okay, what do we do? And it's a lot. It's systematic theology is hard. It's really
yeah.
hard.
What do you classify yourself as now, or do you have a label for yourself to try to express, like, what you hold to?
With regards to like God and time and stuff like this,
Yeah,
or
and like Molinism maybe.
yeah, so like something in the neighborhood of Molinism, but again, it's some of the bells and whistles, some of the more nuanced details where I'm like, that seems weird. So like Molina's account of concurrence, I go, that's just super weird. I don't know how you get free will on that. And then how does God know the future? Molinism doesn't actually give you a story there, and I'm like, that bothers me because I would like to have a story there. And the thing is, like, other than Calvinist, I don't really see a clear answer to that question. How does God know the future? With regards to God and time, I want to say God's temporal. God's eternal in that God exists without beginning and without end. But God's temporal in that God has a location, like he exists now, and he has succession in his life. And that's the only view that the Bible knows. All the words for eternity in Scripture are temporal words, and the history of Christian theology like is aware of this fact. What you have is different theologians going, "What do we do that we know God's timeless? It's obvious. It's obvious. Like science and philosophy tells us God's. Why does the Bible say the exact opposite?" That's been the big question throughout church history: is what do we do with the fact that God has not revealed Himself as timeless? And I'm like, well, what you do with the fact is that God's not timeless. That's why he didn't reveal himself as timeless.
Well,
Like,
what do you mean by that? Because like when you see like a statement in the Bible, like I think Psalms 92, like from everlasting to everlasting.
mhm.
Do you mean to say like those are just temporal language we're using to ascribe something to God or about who He is?
It's not just that it's using temporal language. It's that is that God is in fact temporal. Because what you have in the Psalm 90 verse 2 case
Hmm.
is you've got the word is olam. I don't know if I'm saying that right because I don't really know Hebrew that well. Um, but the word olam just means a long time, or perpetual duration, is sometimes how it's translated. And the word is used twice there, which is a common Old Testament way of talking to designate a stretch of time. So from the days of King Saul to the days of King David. You see this constantly throughout the Old Testament. They give a to from to specify a range of
Hmm.
time. What you have in the Psalm 90 passage is fascinating because you have from olam to olam, from perpetual duration to perpetual duration. It's the best way to really describe from like everlasting to everlasting is how
Hmm.
we typically translate
Yeah.
in English. It's it's not just simply temporal terms; it's also temporal ways of talking to specify a temporal stretch. And this is God's from everlasting for everlasting before the foundations of the world. So Gershom Brin, who is a Hebrew Bible scholar and a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, he says the oldest time mentioned in Scripture is of God's reality before creation. And this is one of the verses that he points to,
Hmm.
is to say you've got a fully, deeply temporal description of God existing temporally before the universe begins to exist. And so that's how deep I think this temporal description of God is in Scripture. You don't see anything like timelessness at all in Scripture. And the vocabulary for timelessness is available, especially to the New Testament authors. And what you see in the book of Revelation is the author has a very clear way to speak about God being timeless, and the author does not do it. Instead, the author uses a very unique way of talking, which is the one who was, is, and is to come, which is explicitly saying this is a being who has a past, this is a being who exists right now, this is a being who has a future. And that was not a popular phrase for, I think, 200 years, even though like that's right there in the Bible. Like a lot of Christians were like, it's too temporal, I don't want to talk that way. So yeah, I just think the biblical authors, they're up to something very different.
Do you still affirm and believe that the God is without beginning?
Yeah, because that's what
Okay,
it means to be eternal.
gotcha.
Yeah, so you'd be saying that. So what it means to begin to exist is that, historically at least, well, actually, it's also like in Eastern philosophy too. What it means to begin to exist is that you are preceded by a state of non-existence. And I want to say God doesn't begin to exist. He's never preceded by a state of non-existence. He's just always existed. Full stop.
Hmm.
Yeah. So God exists without beginning and without end because he's eternal. But he has succession. He exists right now. He existed in the past. He will exist in the future.
I have like a personal theory where it's like when it says in the beginning, and I'm like I don't really hold strongly to this, but I think I may think that refers just to our beginning in the universe. Like maybe like time isn't what we know, and like there always was something called time or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like it's just speculation for me because I realize
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know. I'm just trying to figure out like what like what do these statements mean?
Yeah. So John Walton, he's an Old Testament scholar, and when he looks at those passages, he gives this really, it's kind of a bizarre sort of account, and uh, I think the best way to understand it is something like this. So he says it's a functional ontology, whereas you and I were more working like with like an existence ontology. So ontology is like just your inventory of all the things that you believe exist.
Hmm.
So I want to go, there's numbers, there's chairs, there's non-physical things like souls and God. There's dogs and cats. These are the things in your ontology. A functional ontology is there's stuff that exists, but you don't really meaningfully talk about them existing until they have a function in the world. And so John Walton says this is what's going on in Genesis. So when what you see in the Genesis creation stories is God giving things a function. So time and space, maybe they already existed, but they didn't have a function. This is the way that Walton talks. I go back and forth about whether or not it makes sense, but I can say something like this. You could say time exists prior to creation. It doesn't have a metric, because what you need in order to have a metric is some sort of consistent ticking, some sort of consistent change by which you can develop a clock. If you've got God all alone, there's nothing you could. It's just impossible to have that. There's nothing that has a consistent tick. There's nothing to create a clock by. So when God creates a universe, he's not creating time. He's creating a watch. So God's not a time maker, he's a watchmaker.
Oh, wow.
That's the name of the book I just finished writing, is called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting book.
Yeah.
And view.
Yeah, it should
Whoa.
be. I'm hoping it'll be a game changer. We'll see. We'll
When's
see.
when's the ETA for that release?
It's under review right now,
Oh, okay.
and so it's whenever they get back to me. And the reviewers are definitely going to want some revisions on something, because they always do. And then it has to be like a copyright. I mean, like when I wrote my first book, The End of the Timeless God, I want to say it was about a year after I got the reviews, where I find a year from getting the reviewer feedback to getting it the copyright, and then another like 6 months before it finally got published.
Hmm.
Whereas like the little book about a big God that I mentioned earlier, that I haven't even like finished writing that technically. I just got the first draft. That's going to get published before this, most likely. Like this
Okay.
time book, which is absurd, but the world of publishing is absurd.
Yeah, sounds like it. What do you think about that one author who I think he was in Four Views of Time, where he argues that time is a attribute of God, which I thought was pretty weird.
So Alan Paget kind of
That
gestures
was his
towards
name.
that,
Okay.
and then Nicholas Wolterstorff uh, says stuff that sounds a lot like it. And so this is the view that I now affirm: that time is an attribute of God.
Oh, you do
It
affirm that now.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
wow.
what I call it the identification view, because when I look at history within Hinduism and within Christianity and maybe Islam, there's a couple people in Islam who might have held this view. The claim is that God is time. And what they mean by that is it's an attribute or a mode of God. So you're identifying time with God in some sense.
Hmm.
So you see this in Isaac Newton, for instance. Emily Thomas, in her book, The Absolute Theory of Time, or called Absolute Time, she says it's the majority view throughout the scientific revolution in the English-speaking world. So it's got there's actually a lot longer history of people affirming this than I thought. Because when I was first kind of exploring this, I was like, this is nuts. Like
Yeah,
this
it
is just
sounds
I mean, this just it sounds crazy.
yeah, I
And
never
then I'm
heard
like,
that
okay,
before.
yeah. And then I'm like, oh, lots of other people affirm it.
Oh, wow.
Maybe it's not as crazy as I thought it was.
Huh. I really like that, that perspective of God just starting the watch now.
Hmm.
I'm like, "Well, okay, that's like a totally different way to think about it," and that just requires me to go back now and start over and be like, "Wow, if that's true, then this means, again, let me just redo my perspective on what I think
Yeah.
God and time is in the relationship."
Yeah. And that's what I try to do in that book is go, if you want to say God's temporal, what are your options? And then what are the implications for the rest of Christian theology?
Hmm.
And trying to explore those to really start how you go about rethinking that. Because I don't think anybody's done that great of a job at figuring out what that means. And so I was like, okay, let's try to sit down and lay the groundwork for that.
This would be a conversation for another time, but
Hmm.
it sounds, I can see how this conversation then goes into divine simplicity.
Hmm.
Because it seems like the Calvinists would want to come along, or maybe I know John Wesley held to divine simplicity. It sounded, at least I can tell he did.
Hmm.
They would want to come along and say, yeah, those are just anthropomorphic, and then they would maybe revert to the B theory of time, and God doesn't experience secession and change and whatnot.
So I know historically all of those figures affirm the presentism. I know that much.
They did, okay.
Yeah. And actually John Wesley also there's at least one passage where it looks like he affirms that time exists before creation,
Really?
because there's this problem. It's called the sooner objection, and it predates Christianity. Augustine tries to deal with it. It's one of the problems that he's worried about. Leibniz is really worried by this problem. There's a bunch of there's a weird history to this. I find it fascinating.
Hmm.
Why didn't God create the universe sooner?
I heard that question before.
Yeah, and so what you have with Samuel Clarke and Isaac Newton is, well, he just didn't feel like it. Like that's it. Like there's just this like millions upon millions of years like just going on forever and ever, and God's just like, okay, now I'll create. And you're like, what? Okay. And Wesley's like says the similar kind of thing. Like he has this passage. I only have like a footnote to it in the book, but it's something like, yeah, maybe millions upon millions of years have gone by, and God's just like, yeah, man, this seems like a good time as any other. And I'm like, I don't know if that's satisfying. Yeah. But
That
to
sounds
your
like
point,
he affirmed then time before time, right?
well, yeah, that's
That would
exactly
require
right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like he's denying that God creates time, because it
Yeah,
seems like
right?
he's really influenced by the sort of Newtonian view of God and time. But I've not done enough Wesleyan research to really see like what's going on there, because I'm pretty sure he affirms like things like simplicity and timelessness. Um,
Same,
but
yeah.
it, but that Newtonian view of time would have been like, I mean, the really predominant scientific view at that point. So that can factor into how he does his theology.
Huh.
But the point about simplicity, this is where the anthropomorphism stuff. This is where I want to say debates between Calvinist Arminians gets really silly, because you'll have these claims of like, well, no, God predestines before he foreknows, and then the Arminians like, no, he foreknows and then he predestines. And then I want to go, if you all affirm divine simplicity, and in Arminius, he's very clear, he affirms this. Calvin doesn't seem as clear on this, but I'm pretty sure he does. But definitely the next generation of Calvinists, they're like, yeah,
Yeah,
simplicity,
they're all for it,
simplicity, or go home.
yep.
All of God's actions, all of God's knowledge, those are all identical to each other and
Yeah.
identical to God's existence. And so I'm like, what do you mean he foreknew and then predestined? No, his foreknowledge and predestination are identical. That's what simplicity means. So your debate is stupid, because you're trying to debate like, well, no, Clark Kent is Superman before he's Clark Kent. No, he's Superman before. You're like, this is the same. This is the same thing. What are you talking about? So the whole debate, I think, falls apart and collapses massively if you have divine simplicity in the mix, and historically
Hmm.
they do.
I
So
know John
I
Wesley said that actually, because you could read his study
mm,
notes on First Peter 1:2, where he talked about foreknowledge, and he said like that's just like an anthropomorphic, and like there is no before and after for God. It's just again that
yeah,
divine simplicity, character, language coming in, where it's just an anthropomorphic talk
yeah.
going on.
So what I think you have, this is something I pointed out in one of the first papers I wrote on divine simplicity, is systematic theology. You sit down, you try to like solve all these problems you've got. How do we get the free will? How do we make sure that like God's election of us is not utterly arbitrary? And you're like, okay, well, he foreknows before he predestines, and whatever. You make all the distinctions you need in order to solve the problem. And then you bring in simplicity and you go, yeah, all those distinctions exist in my head alone. They don't exist in reality. You see Aquinas do this a million times. And I go, well, what you've done now is you've committed all of your work to the flames. You just spent 30, 40 pages making all these nice, careful distinctions. And then you go, yeah, but it's just in my head. It doesn't apply to God. And I'm like, then why did you waste my time and your time writing all this out?
That's why I have a problem with that. Like I feel like too, it's like what they're saying is, I don't know, and that's the only thing I do know. What's like, well, and I always think, well, how do you know that you don't know if you don't know? And
Mhm.
I just feel like it gets you nowhere.
Yeah, it gets you nowhere real fast. And so like if you don't know something, that's fine.
Yeah.
But don't waste 300 pages of telling me what God's like and then be like, actually I don't know anything. I'm like,
Yeah, because and I always revert to it, as well. It's like if language is just semantics, it doesn't tell us anything about the ontology of God. I feel like that's not what the Bible teaches. Because I feel like God communicates His deity to us, and there
mhm.
are some things that we can know, and He makes it clear that we can know it.
That's what it
And
seems like.
yeah, so it's
What
like
you've
I can't commit to divine simplicity because I feel like for them, divine simplicity really just means divine accommodation.
Yeah,
But that means you can't know anything, and so it's like I don't know that I don't see that in the scriptures.
I don't either. And then Calvin's doctrine of accommodation, it's not what most people say it is. So Calvin is really clear. His doctrine of accommodation, he says, this is not, I'm not going to get the quote just exact, but he says God reveals Himself to us as we see Him, not as He actually is. So when God accommodates to us, He reveals Himself to us as we want to see Him, not as He actually is. And I'm like, hang on. So we never actually, God never reveals Himself as He actually is. He only reveals Himself to us as we want to see Him.
Yeah, that's so weird.
And what I do in a recent paper that I published called Closeness with God, A Problem for Impassibility, is I look at this claim from the classical tradition that the simple and timeless and impassible God does not have any empathy. He does not literally have any empathy. He does not literally have any compassion or mercy. These are not analogical statements. They are metaphor, purely
Mm.
metaphor. And the metaphor is supposed to mean that He doesn't feel anything with you. He's just in a state of pure, like awesome bliss and everything. And I'm like, okay, so God has no empathy at all, literally no empathy, not even analogical empathy. And He reveals Himself to us in Scripture consistently as a being that is rich in empathy, rich in mercy, rich in compassion. And He knows that He's not like that at all. But He's going to tell us that we're like that. Why? Calvin says in his commentary on Hosea, God presents Himself that way so that we would draw closer to Him. And I'm like, who else do we know? Is there another class of people that we know that have no empathy and that engage in that kind of manipulative behavior? The psychological literature is very clear on this. These are called psychopaths. And so I'm like, you've given us a picture of God who's maximally psychopathic. I don't think that's what you wanted. I don't think that's where you really wanted to go with this.
Psychopath. That's
So
pretty good.
maybe we should try to like go back to the drawing board and like let's try this again, because this is not where you wanted this to go.
Yeah, because I feel like what that collapses into is like God is only ever doing, but surprise, what He did was always what He was going to do, and that was from all eternity. And when you press me on it, I'm just going to say that's just logical, moments, but even
Mhm.
those moments don't even exist. So it's like, what is God even doing and revealing, and do we
Right.
even know anything? And I feel like that's not what God tells us in His Word.
It's not, and what's more bizarre. This is something I've pointed out and something that William Hasker points out in a debate he had with Catherine Rogers. So the doctrine of accommodation, when you see people like Stephen Charnock, who's a Calvinist, and he's trying to like develop this a bit more. Is a generation after Calvin. He'll give a deeper explanation for why exactly is it the case that God has to reveal himself as temporal and passionate and changing. Why does he always reveal himself that way in Scripture when we know he's not? And the answer from Charnock is, well, because you're stupid. Like, you're just too stupid to understand what God's really like, so God has to reveal himself this way. And so Hasker raises this really interesting question. He's like, okay. So Moses and Isaiah are too stupid to understand what God's like. So God has to be like, I'm temporal, I'm mutable, I can change. I've got all these emotions. I'm not really like that because you're too stupid to understand that I'm really like that. But Anselm, Aquinas, Augustine, these people, well, they were smart enough to like be able to read between the lines and figure out, when God said he's sad, what he really means is he's like in the state of like pure joy and happiness. When God says he's suffering, no, he didn't mean. He meant like, when he said he has empathy, he meant he doesn't actually have empathy. They're able to. Why is it the case that they're not too stupid to understand these things, but Moses and Isaiah and Jeremiah, they're too stupid to understand these things? And what I do with that statement is I kind of push further and go, maybe God made a really terrible decision of who he revealed himself to. I mean, if Moses is so dumb that he can't understand these things, that God had to reveal himself in these other ways, God should have just waited till Aquinas was born and just revealed himself to Aquinas.
Yeah, right.
He should not have revealed himself to Aquinas' teacher, Peter of Ireland, because Peter of Ireland says God changes and God has passions. But he should have waited till like the dumb ox was born, because like that guy, he knows. So you get this really bizarre account of God when you start pushing it, and I think you should push it really hard, because then you start to see this doesn't make sense on a lot of layers. There's a lot of like problems here.
Yeah, and then they're telling you that God is able to communicate that that you really can't know, and he knows that you can't know it. So it's like, well, what's even the point of any of this? I feel like it's just a redundancy.
It feels redundant, and it also feels like, God, you it's impossible for you to reveal yourself. So, or you're just a terrible communicator. Like, I mean, like if I want to tell you, like I don't have any empathy, and I'm like, hey man, I've got all this empathy. Like that, they're just gonna be like, Ryan, you just don't know how to communicate. Do you not understand basic language? And I want to say God does understand basic language. Like he has basic like reading comprehension skills. That God knows how to communicate. So it's just, I think it makes God look like an idiot. And I want to go, God's not an idiot. So let's not have our theology entail these things. Let's not have a theology that entails God's a psychopath or that God's an idiot. Like let's have a theology that entails God's perfectly wise and perfectly good.
But the thing is, though, is like people who hold divine simplicity will make it out like you said, like go divine simplicity or go home.
Yeah.
I remember hearing you from a different talk one day pointing out, it's like, if this is such a fundamental doctrine of Christianity, like you go to seminary, Bible college, like they don't really teach this. And if it's so fundamental, like, well, why not? Like most people, they can go to church for years and maybe the whole life, and they'll never hear this doctrine.
Yeah.
But if it's such a safe, doctrine that's going to guard us from heresy and foundational, why does nobody tell us about this?
It's a weird one that I had to figure out myself, because I went through most of my undergraduate training without even hearing of the doctrine, and it was my own independent reading of Aquinas where I encountered it, and then I went back and reread Augustine, and I was like, oh my God, it's all right here, and started digging into it, and then I get to my master's, and then the doctrine starts to make a comeback. Like it starts becoming a bit more popular again. And then all these people are like, we got to retrieve the great tradition, and all this kind of rhetoric that we hear now. Like that was just starting. And so it was quite easy for anybody in earlier generations to like go through seminary and not ever hear this thing, because it's not in the Bible. Like you're not going to find it in the Bible. But the propaganda surrounding it is just outrageous. I mean, like the propaganda around it is that like, this is the view that all Jews, all Christians, all Muslims affirmed. And I want to go, no. The majority of Jews prior to Maimonides did not affirm this. Yoram Hazoni's made that very clear. I even like this summer, I was at a debate between a Jew and a Muslim, and Harvey Zev was the Jewish scholar, and he was like, yeah, this is not the Jewish view of God. And I'm like, ooh, okay. Well, tell that to all the simplicity propaganda people. And then I go and talk to the Muslims, and the majority view in the Kalam theological tradition is what's called the Al-Maturidi, following this guy named Al-Maturidi. Al-Maturidi explicitly rejects divine simplicity. So does Al-Ghazali. And there's a long tradition that predates both of them, where it's called the attributionist view that denies divine simplicity. And the majority view today is of Muslims who consider themselves to be Maturidian Muslims.
Hmm.
And so I'm like, the view that all Jews, Christians, and Muslims affirmed is, oh, wait, oh, no, it's not divine simplicity. Divine simplicity has been a controversial view, full stop. And then in the Hindu tradition, same thing. You've got a couple people here that affirm it, but Ramanuja doesn't. So I'm like, no, this is just propaganda when people are going like, this is this huge important doctrine. If you lose it, you don't have God. And I'm like,
Yeah,
no.
yeah, it can get pretty heated pretty fast,
Yeah, it
and
does.
they can accuse you really fast of like, oh, you're being a heretic, or
Yeah.
you're going down that open theist route where you just God is a failure and he changes, and it's like what?
I'm like, well,
Like,
Al-Ghazali
chill.
rejected it, but he still affirmed timelessness and all this stuff. And
Yeah,
then
maybe we
TJ
need more
Mawson at
debates.
Oxford does this. Like he's like so TJ Mawson at Oxford, I love him to death. Like he wants to affirm God's timeless, but his simplicity. He says we should have put our hands up and stopped the conversation well before we started saying like all of God's attributes are identical to each other. Like he's just like, this has got to go. So I don't think it's this big slippery slope that a lot of people want to say it is.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Maybe we'll have you if you want in the future. We have you
Mhm.
back on. We'll talk more about this because
Yeah,
this
because
is
I'm going to
it's
be
important.
in a debate book. It's called Divine Simplicity: Five Views that
Oh,
Ross Inman is
really?
editing. And so I'm just now starting to get
That's
other people's
awesome.
essays, and I'm going to have to write my response to everybody.
I
So
can't wait.
that's all in the mix right now. So yeah, at some
Wow.
point, yeah, you can come back on and talk about that.
Is that from the Counterpoint series? Is Zondervan?
No, it's going to be with Bloomsbury.
Okay.
Zondervan, I think
Wow.
Zondervan was just sleeping on it. They just never got back to Ross for like 6 months or a year on this project, and so he's like, okay, I'll go to another publisher.
Okay.
So again,
Wow.
the publishing world is like, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll definitely read that book. That'll be very, very interesting. Are there any books in the, besides yours coming out in the future? Any
Mhm.
books you recommend for people to want to understand like Molinism more? Like,
Mhm.
top ones that you would recommend for first time readers, or just great for learning this.
Yeah, so there's this brand new book that came out. This is by Kirk McGregor. So this
Oh,
is I just got this in the mail like recently. So it's called Molinist Philosophical and Theological Adventures.
cool.
It's pretty short. It's really a pretty easy read, but it might just feel like it's an easy read because I've read so much of this stuff.
Y-
So
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Maybe
when
you
you
like someone like who's starting out.
yeah, so someone who's just starting out, I would say read read like that Four Views on Divine Foreknowledge or the Four Views on Providence book. And just because like William Lane Craig has an essay in both of those,
Oh,
and
okay.
you'll get like short, sweet statement of what Molinism is. Then from
Gotcha.
there, you could probably read something like Kirk McGregor's book, and then maybe advance on to something like William Lane Craig's book, the only wise God.
Yep.
I think is what it's called. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff to read, but yeah, start with something like one of the Four Views books on Providence or Foreknowledge, and to get
Awesome.
those Craig essays, just because
Okay.
yeah, this stuff's it's hard, and so
It is.
finding something that's easy to get wet your whistle on this is the best way to go.
I'll put those books in the description
Mhm.
to the links.
Good.
Um, on that note too, any final words of encouragement, and maybe like why does this not debate matter, but just like why does this doctrine matter, this studying matter in these issues?
Mhm.
Anything you want to leave us with?
Yeah. So I think it matters because you our relationship with God is a relationship built on trust. I mean, that's what faith is trust. We are trusting in God's promises. And we want to know that God is a trustworthy being and that his promises are safe and secure. That like when he says, I'm going to save you from death, you want to know that that's actually reliable. Because if it's not, then you don't want to put your trust in God. So these debates about predestination, about providence and foreknowledge, I think they really come back to that question: is this a being that is trustworthy? Can we actually put our trust in God? That's where I think it matters. The words of encouragement, I guess I'd say this: this stuff is really hard. I mean, like what we've been talking about for the last 2 hours is just like
Yeah.
scratching the surface of what I've been up to trying to study for the last like 12, 15 years. This is complicated stuff. And so I encourage people to, try to read as much as you can on these topics, but also encourage you to be gracious towards other people because you're going to disagree with everyone at some point on something. And when you get into these kind of issues, on providence, you disagree with everyone almost immediately. Like I walk into a room and I'm like, okay, I disagree with everyone in this room on something. Like, and that's fine. And that's fine. So I just yeah, just the point about being gracious and charitable with people is because like this is really hard stuff and we're trying to figure this out together. So be gracious with one another and just stop like just throwing around like, oh, you believe God knows the future, then you think God loves the Holocaust, and like, and like not this kind of stuff. Just be more gracious because these are really difficult issues to think through.
And it's such a cool study too. Like like what you'll find out is that this really does go into a lot of other things,
Yes.
and it causes me to question this doctrine or look into this doctrine more and investigate. Okay, what does this mean? Even like you mentioned too, like theories of atonement, creation. So it's not just like, oh, okay, just this view. It's like, wow, this really goes into a lot, and
Yeah.
it really is such a cool, fascinating study. So it's hard, but we'll exercise our spiritual muscles and get into the Bible. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to think about, what does the Bible say?
Hmm.
Like, what does the scripture say? Like, be a Berean. We test all things by the word of God.
Yeah. Amen. Amen.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being on here. Oh, do you have any I guess a YouTube channel we can follow you on, or besides like the online classes, any
Mhm.
like links or websites?
Yeah. So if you go to rtmullins.com, you can
RT Mullins.
find links to, I think, all the videos that I've done.
Okay.
I got to double because I've done, I don't know how many of these videos, interviews. And then my podcast, The Reluctant Theologian.
Oh,
So where I'm the host and I'm doing interviews with lots of people and sometimes have episodes where I just address my own like questions and
cool.
whatnot.
Awesome.
So
I
yeah,
didn't
so
know
those
that.
are the places to go.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for watching. If you can subscribe to Method Ministries and like and share this video. And this has been Ryan Mullins talking about Molinism. And also, we talked about a whole lot more, but it was a pleasure, Ryan. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. All right, guys, take care.